There are truths we carry that official records refuse to hold. Some men spend their entire lives knowing what they did, where they went, what they witnessed, only to be told by institutions with locked filing cabinets and stamped documents that none of it happened. They flew missions that left fuel burns on runways. They maintained aircraft that consumed parts and oil and time. They briefed coordinates, studied maps, returned with empty ammunition bays, and stories they were instructed never to tell. And when they asked for the paperwork that would prove their service, they were handed silence wrapped in classification stamps and polite institutional denial. The gap between lived experience and official history is not always an error. Sometimes it is a choice. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely read every comment that comes through. Have you ever known something to be absolutely true? Something you did, something you witnessed, something that shaped your understanding of the world, only to find that no documentation exists to support your memory? Maybe it was a family story that official records contradict, or a workplace event that was scrubbed from company files, or military service that doesn't appear in the databases the way you remember it. Drop your answer in the comments while you listen. I want to know if this feeling, this specific isolation of being the only remaining proof of something real, is something you recognize. February 1953 arrived cold across the Korean peninsula, but not with the bone-breaking cold that had defined the previous 2 winters of the war. This was a different season entirely. The cold of uncertainty rather than endurance. The cold that came with knowing the war was ending, but not knowing how or when or what the final hours would demand. In the airspace above the 38th parallel, American pilots flew missions that had changed character entirely from the early months of the conflict. These were not the sweeping advances of 1950 or the desperate retreats of 1951. These were the missions of a war that had calcified into position, where every sortie was measured against diplomatic negotiations happening in tents at Panmunjom, where pilots understood that the next mission might be the last, or might be followed by 6 more months of identical runs over identical terrain. The landscape below them was no longer the Korea of rice paddies and mountain villages. It was a Korea of strategic coordinates, of targets that mattered to men in distant capitals, of valleys that had been bombed so many times the earth itself had been restructured into geometries of craters and debris. Route 66. Airfield sat in the hills northwest of Suwon, close enough to the main air operations to share supply lines, but far enough removed to operate with a degree of separation that pilots noticed immediately upon arrival. It was not marked on the maps that most personnel carried. The designation itself, Route 66, was borrowed from the American Highway, a piece of nomenclature that felt deliberately civilian, deliberately unmilitary, as though someone in command had decided that official-sounding names drew official-sounding attention. The airfield was a single strip of compacted earth and metal plating carved into a valley that ran east to west, flanked by hills that provided natural concealment from ground observation but made approaches technical in any wind. There were no permanent structures. Everything was tent canvas and corrugated metal, arranged in configurations that could be dismantled in hours if orders came through. The fuel depot was half buried, the munitions storage was dispersed across 3 separate locations, and the communications tent operated with equipment that pilots recognized as more sophisticated than what they had seen at larger, more established bases. This was an airfield built for impermanence, but maintained with a precision that suggested something other than temporary duty. The aircraft that operated from Route 66 were predominantly F-86 Sabres and F-84 Thunderjets, the workhorses of American air superiority operations in Korea, but the maintenance schedules were different here. Pilots noticed that their aircraft were serviced between missions with an intensity usually reserved for experimental programs or high-priority intelligence flights. Fuel loads were calculated with unusual precision, ammunition configurations changed mission to mission based on briefings that came from sources pilots could not identify. And the flight logs, the daily documentation that every pilot filled out as reflexively as breathing, were collected immediately upon landing and disappeared into the operations tent, never to be referenced again in the pilot's presence. This was not how standard combat air operations worked, and every man stationed at Route 66 understood that without anyone ever stating it directly. Major Thomas Blackwell stood 6 feet and 1 inch with the build of a man who had spent 10 years in cockpits, shoulders broad from holding control columns through turbulence, forearms developed from working manual systems, core strength built from sustaining G-forces that compressed the spine and tested the limits of human circulation. His hands were what you noticed first if you were paying attention. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles from a decade of working around hot metal and sharp cowlings, with calluses along the inner edge of each thumb from gripping throttle controls for hours at sustained altitude. The left hand had a scar that ran from the base of the index finger across the palm to the wrist, a burn from 1945, from bailing out of a damaged P-51 Mustang over Germany and catching his hand on the canopy rail as he went through. He did not speak about that scar unless directly ass, and even then only in the fewest words necessary. His face was asymmetrical in the way that faces become when they have absorbed years of physical strain. The right side of his jaw sat slightly higher than the left, the result of a fracture that had healed without proper medical attention during the final months of World War II, when combat missions outpaced the availability of flight surgeons and pilots learned to treat their own injuries with tape and silence. His hair was dark brown, cut in the standard military fashion, beginning to show gray at the temples in a way that made him look older than 34. His eyes were pale gray, the color of overcast sky at altitude, and they communicated a quality that other pilots found difficult to name. Not suspicion exactly, but a permanent state of observation, as though he were constantly comparing what he was being told against what he was seeing and finding small discrepancies that he noted without comment. Blackwell had been flying combat missions since 1944. He had logged over 800 hours of combat time across 2 wars, had downed 3 German aircraft in the final year of the European theater, and had transitioned to jets with the kind of technical precision that made him valuable to commanders who needed pilots capable of handling complex aircraft in high-pressure environments. He understood aircraft systems at a level that exceeded most pilots, could diagnose mechanical problems from subtle changes in engine sound or control responsiveness, could calculate fuel consumption rates in his head with accuracy that matched ground crews with calculators and charts. He had been assigned to Route 66 Airfield in mid-February of 1953 with orders that were unusual in their brevity: report to coordinates, assume command of air operations, await further instruction, no unit designation, no operational overview, no explanation of what air operations were being conducted or why they required a commander of his experience. He had learned over 10 years of military service that certain questions produced answers, and certain questions produced only reassignment, and he had developed an instinct for distinguishing between the two. What troubled Blackwell was not the secrecy itself. He had flown classified missions before, had operated under information restrictions that were standard for intelligence gathering operations. What troubled him was the architecture of the secrecy at Route 66. It was not structured like standard compartmentalization, where certain personnel knew certain elements and the overall mission was divided into discrete components for security. This was different. This was a system where no one seemed to possess the complete picture, where even he, the operations commander, received mission briefings that felt deliberately incomplete, where pilots were given coordinates without context and told to fly patterns that made tactical sense only if there were additional elements he was not being shown. He carried a small notebook in his flight jacket, a habit from his earliest days of pilot training, where he recorded details that struck him as inconsistent or unexplained. By the end of February, the notebook had 17 entries, each one a small observation that meant nothing in isolation, but together began to form a pattern he could not yet name. The world around Route 66 Airfield was populated by men who had learned to function in the strange space between military hierarchy and operational autonomy that characterized the final months of the Korean War. Captain Raymond Stark was the senior maintenance officer, a man from Pennsylvania coal country who had joined the Air Force in 1946 and discovered he had an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that no amount of formal training could teach. He was shorter than Blackwell, maybe 5 feet 9 inches, with hands that were permanently stained black from hydraulic fluid and engine grease, fingernails that had given up any pretense of cleanliness years ago. Stark had worked on every American fighter aircraft from the P-47 Thunderbolt forward, and he maintained the Route 66 aircraft with a precision that bordered on obsessive. He did not ask questions about the missions his aircraft were flying. He simply ensured they returned from each sortie in condition to fly the next one. Blackwell had learned to trust Stark's instincts about mechanical anomalies. If Stark said an aircraft was showing signs of stress beyond what combat missions should produce, Blackwell listened. Lieutenant James Keller was the communications officer, a former college student from Oregon who had enlisted in 1950 and found himself responsible for managing radio traffic and encrypted communications at an airfield that officially did not exist in standard Air Force records. Keller was thin, nervous, competent in the way that young officers are competent when they understand their job perfectly but do not yet understand the larger systems within which that job operates. He monitored every transmission that came through Route 66, logged every communication, and had begun, without being instructed to do so, keeping a second set of logs that recorded discrepancies between what he was hearing and what official channels were reporting. He did not show these logs to anyone, but Blackwell knew they existed because he had seen Keller writing in a personal notebook during night shifts, and Blackwell recognized the behavior of a man documenting something he suspected would later need documentation. First, Lieutenant Michael Chen was the intelligence officer, which meant he was responsible for mission briefings, for translating orders from higher command into tactical instructions pilots could execute, and for debriefing pilots after missions to extract information that would inform subsequent operations. Chen was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco, fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese, which made him valuable for certain types of intelligence work that other officers could could not perform. He was quiet, methodical, and carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned early that his competence would be questioned in ways that white officers' competence would not be. Chen had been at Route 66 since the airfield became operational in January, and he knew more about what the airfield was actually doing than anyone else stationed there. But he had been given instructions about what information could be shared and what information was to remain within his awareness only. Blackwell had tried several times to have longer conversations with Chen about the overall mission profile, and each time Chen had provided answers that were technically accurate but substantively incomplete, and both men understood what was happening without acknowledging it. The decision that made everything inevitable was not dramatic. It occurred on the morning of February 23rd, during a routine briefing in the operations tent. Chen was reviewing coordinates for that day's sorties, and Blackwell noticed that the coordinates did not align with the operational area that had been designated in the previous week's briefings. The discrepancy was not large, maybe 15 miles northwest of where missions had been concentrated, but it was enough that Blackwell asked for clarification. Chen hesitated, which was unusual for him, and then said that the coordinates came from higher command and were not to be questioned. Blackwell did not push further in the moment, but after the briefing he pulled out his notebook and recorded the coordinates along with a note about Chen's hesitation. That evening, after the day's missions had been completed and the pilots were in their quarters, Blackwell cross-referenced the coordinates against the maps he had access to and discovered that the area they had been flying was closer to the Yalu River than operational protocols should have permitted. Not across the Yalu, that would have been a direct violation of engagement rules that could trigger wider conflict with China or the Soviet Union, but close enough that navigation errors or equipment malfunctions could easily result in airspace violations, and close enough that whatever they were observing or targeting in that area was significant enough to justify the risk. He made a decision that night that he did not fully articulate to himself at the time. He decided to pay closer attention, not to question orders directly that would accomplish nothing except his own reassignment, but to document, to record, to maintain a parallel archive of what was actually happening at Route 66 Airfield, because he had the growing sense that if he did not, there would be no archive at all. Life in the deep of Route 66. Airfield settled into patterns that were not comfortable but became familiar. Pilots woke before dawn, attended briefings in the operations tent where Chen distributed mission folders that contained coordinates and altitudes and radio frequencies but rarely contained explanations of what they were looking for or why. They pre-flighted their aircraft with Stark's maintenance crews, who worked through the night to ensure every system was functioning within tolerances that exceeded standard combat requirements. They flew missions that lasted anywhere from 90 minutes to 4 hours, depending on fuel load and operational parameters. Missions that took them over terrain they had seen dozens of times before, but were now seeing from specific angles and altitudes that suggested someone was building a comprehensive surveillance map of areas that official reconnaissance was not supposed to be monitoring. They returned, debriefed with Chen, ate meals that were prepared by rotating kitchen crews who flew in supplies from Swan twice a week, and then repeated the cycle. The work was not extraordinary in its individual components, but it was extraordinary in its intensity and in the absence of context. What was beautiful about it, and there was beauty, though the men would not have used that word, was the precision. These were pilots who had learned to trust aircraft and trust each other in conditions where trust was the only thing that kept you alive. When Blackwell flew formation with Captain Robert Hayes and Lieutenant David Morrison, he did not need to communicate every adjustment. They had developed the kind of silent coordination that comes from hundreds of hours in the air together, where small movements of wing or nose communicated intention more clearly than radio calls ever could. They flew through weather that would have grounded less experienced pilots, low clouds that reduced visibility to hundreds of feet, turbulence that came off the mountains and waves that tested control surfaces and pilot endurance alike. And they did it with a casualness that looked like arrogance from the ground but was actually the opposite. It was humility. It was the recognition that the aircraft in the air would do what they would do, and the pilot's job was simply to make the necessary adjustments and not to overcorrect out of fear or pride. The landscape they flew over was a landscape of war that had aged into something else. The villages below had been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, until the pattern of destruction became the permanent geography. The roads were carved with tank tracks and artillery craters. The fields that should have been preparing for spring planting were instead pocked with positions and fortifications that neither side fully manned but neither side abandoned, and above it all, at 20,000 feet, American pilots flew patterns that would show up in photographic reconnaissance as abstract geometries, lines and circles and systematic sweeps that suggested purpose but did not. To anyone observing from the ground, reveal what that purpose was. Blackwell found himself thinking about documentation more than he ever had before. Every mission he flew was recorded in his personal log with details that exceeded what official forms required. He expressed exact coordinates, specific altitudes, notable landmarks, weather conditions, radio traffic anomalies, anything that that might later help reconstruct what had actually occurred. He did not know why he felt compelled to do this. Perhaps it was the absence of official curiosity about what they were finding. After missions, Chen would debrief them with questions that were narrowly focused on specific data points. Did you observe activity at this coordinate? Did you notice changes in this terrain feature? Did you encounter aircraft or anti-aircraft fire in this sector? But never the larger question of what the accumulated observations meant. It was intelligence gathering without synthesis. And Blackwell had been in the military long enough to know that intelligence gathered without synthesis was intelligence being synthesized somewhere else by someone else, for purposes the field operators were not cleared to understand. The first anomaly occurred on March 7th, and it was small enough that Blackwell almost dismissed it. He was flying a routine reconnaissance sweep with Hayes and Morrison, following a pattern they had flown a dozen times before, northwest from Route 66 toward coordinates that brought them parallel to the Yalu River at a distance of approximately 20 miles, then a long arc southward before returning to base. The mission should have taken 2 hours and 15 minutes based on fuel consumption and flight plan, but when they landed, Stark's crew recorded fuel levels that indicated they had been airborne for closer to 3 hours. The discrepancy was not large, maybe 35 minutes of flight time unaccounted for. But it was outside the margin of error that experienced crews accepted. Blackwell asked Hayes and Morrison if they had noticed anything unusual during the flight. Both said no. He checked his own notes from the mission and found nothing that explained the additional fuel consumption. No extended combat, no deviations from the planned route, no equipment malfunctions that would have required circling or alternate approaches. He mentioned it to Stark that evening, and Stark said he had noticed similar discrepancies in other aircraft over the previous 2 weeks. Not every mission, maybe 1 in every 4 or 5 sorties showed fuel consumption that exceeded what the flight plan should have required. Stark had assumed it was navigation errors or headwinds that pilots were not reporting. But when Blackwell pressed him on whether the discrepancies followed any pattern, Stark admitted that they seemed more common on missions that flew northwest toward the Yalu River coordinates. Blackwell recorded this in his notebook, March 7th, fuel discrepancy, check pattern against mission routes, and decided to start tracking fuel consumption more systematically against mission profiles. Over the next 10 days, 3 more fuel discrepancies occurred, and Blackwell began to notice something else. The missions that showed unusual fuel consumption were also the missions where his sense of time felt slightly distorted during the flight. Not dramatically. He was not losing consciousness or experiencing blackouts. But there were moments during these missions where his attention seemed to skip slightly, where he would check his instruments and find that more time had passed than he remembered accounting for. He tested this by using a stopwatch during one mission, clicking it at regular intervals to mark his attention to time passage, and discovered that his interval clicks were consistent with the flight plan timeline, but his fuel consumption was still showing the discrepancy, which meant either the fuel gauges were malfunctioning across multiple aircraft, or something about these particular missions was consuming fuel at rates that standard flight operations could not explain. He tried to discuss this with Chen during a debriefing, and Chen listened carefully, made notes, and then said that fuel consumption variations were common in combat theater operations and that Stark's crews were probably correct in attributing the discrepancies to environmental factors. Blackwell recognized the response as deflection, which meant Chen either knew what was causing the discrepancies and was not authorized to explain, or Chen did not know and had been instructed not to investigate. Either possibility troubled Blackwell more than a direct explanation would have. The escalation began on March 19th, and it was no longer small. Blackwell was flying a solo reconnaissance mission, standard procedure for experienced pilots who could operate alone when multi-aircraft formations were not required, when his radio began picking up transmissions in a language he did not recognize, not Korean, not Chinese, which he had heard enough times to identify even without understanding. This was something else, Russian, he thought, as though his Russian was limited to a few phrases from intelligence briefings about Soviet aircraft identification. The transmissions were brief, lasting maybe 15 seconds, and they were on a frequency that American pilots did not typically monitor. He would not have heard them at all, except that he was conducting a radio systems check and happened to scan through frequencies outside the standard operational band. He recorded the incident in his post-flight notes with as much detail as he could recall: approximate time, exact frequency, duration of transmission, his position when he heard it. During debriefing, he mentioned it to Chen, who asked him to repeat the frequency 3 times, and then made notes without comment. 2 days later, Blackwell flew another solo mission along a similar route, and again he heard transmissions on the same frequency, but this time they were longer, maybe 45 seconds, and there were 2 distinct voices clearly communicating with each other in what sounded like operational coordination. He landed and went directly to Chen's office, and this time Chen did not deflect. He said, very carefully, that Blackwell was not to mention these transmissions to other pilots, was not to include them in official flight flight logs and was to report them only during private debriefings with Chen. Blackwell asked why. Chen said that the transmissions were known, were being monitored, and were part of intelligence gathering that Blackwell was not cleared to know more about. That night, Blackwell sat in his quarters and understood something clearly for the first time. Route 66. Airfield was not conducting standard combat air operations. They were conducting surveillance of Soviet aircraft activity in airspace near the Yalu River, and the surveillance was occurring at a level of classification that exceeded anything Blackwell had been briefed on. The fuel discrepancies were explained. Pilots were flying closer to the Yalu than their official flight plans indicated, close enough to monitor Soviet communications and activity, and the additional fuel consumption was the cost of those deviations. The lack of documentation was explained. If American aircraft were operating in proximity to Soviet forces, especially forces that might be based in Chinese or North Korean territory, that represented potential for conflict escalation that the armistice negotiations could not accommodate, and the compartmentalization was explained. Chen knew what was happening because he was the intelligence officer, but pilots were being kept partially ignorant so that if confronted they could honestly claim they were following standard flight plans without knowledge of the larger intelligence operation. Blackwell did not sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the aircraft he had seen on previous missions, distant contrails that could have been American or could have been something else, radar contacts that appeared and disappeared without resolution. He thought about the Soviet MiG-15s that American pilots had been engaging throughout the war, and about the persistent rumors that Soviet pilots were flying some of those MiGs, not just training North Korean or Chinese pilots, but actively engaging American forces in combat that both sides pretended was not happening, and he thought about what it meant to fly missions that your own command structure would later deny. Missions that existed in the gap between what was documented and what was real. The escalation continued. On March 24th, Captain Hayes reported that during a mission northwest of Route 66, he had achieved radar lock on an aircraft that was not responding to IFF, identification friend or foe. But when he requested permission to engage, he was told to break contact and return to base. Hayes was frustrated because the radar signature suggested an aircraft type that was not supposed to be operating in that area, and breaking contact meant they had lost an opportunity to identify or intercept a potential threat. Blackwell listened to Hayes describe the incident and understood that the order to break contact had come from somewhere other than Route 66 Command, had come from someone monitoring their operations in real time and making decisions based on priorities that field commanders were not cleared to understand. On March 28th, Lieutenant Morrison returned from a mission with gun camera footage that showed an aircraft he identified as a Soviet MiG-15 at a distance of approximately 4 miles, flying parallel to his course at similar altitude. Morrison had not engaged because he had not been fired upon, and his orders were to avoid initiating contact with unidentified aircraft. But the footage was clear enough to show markings and configuration that intelligence analysts would recognize. Morrison submitted the film as part of standard debriefing procedure, and the film was collected and disappeared into whatever classification system Route 66 operated under. 3 days later, Morrison asked Chen if there had been any analysis of the footage, and Chen said the footage had been forwarded to higher command and no further information was available. Blackwell began to notice that missions were changing character in early April. The briefings became more specific about what to observe and more explicit about what not to engage. Pilots were given instructions to maintain visual contact with unidentified aircraft when possible, but never to close to engagement range. They were told to document radar contacts with precision, but not to request intercept authority. They were flying surveillance missions in contested airspace during the final months of a war that was supposed to be winding down, and the intensity of the surveillance suggested that someone in command believed there was still critical intelligence to gather before operations ceased entirely. On April 9th, something happened that Blackwell could not explain and could not dismiss. He was flying a mission with Hayes and Morrison, standard 3 aircraft formation, when all 3 pilots simultaneously lost radio contact with Route 66 for approximately 12 minutes. Not static or interference, complete silence, as though the base had stopped transmitting entirely. They continued the mission because they were experienced enough to operate independently, but when they landed and asked Keller what had caused the communications blackout, Keller said there had been no blackout on his end. He had been transmitting continuously and had received no indication that the aircraft were not receiving. Blackwell checked his radio logs, Hayes checked his, Morrison checked his. All 3 showed the same 12-minute gap. Keller's logs showed continuous transmission. The discrepancy was impossible unless someone had the capability to selectively block communications to specific aircraft while maintaining the appearance of normal operations, and Blackwell could not think of any equipment or procedure that would produce that effect. He went to Chen and described the incident, and for the first time, Chen looked genuinely genuinely surprised, not concerned, surprised, as though this was an anomaly that even he had not anticipated. Chen said he would investigate and would report back. He never did. 3 days later, Blackwell asked Chen if there had been any findings about the communications gap, and Chen said that equipment malfunctions sometimes produced anomalies that could not be fully explained and that the incident had been noted but did not require further investigation. That was when Blackwell understood that he was not going to receive answers through official channels. Whatever Route 66 was doing, whatever intelligence operation was being conducted from the airfield, it was structured in a way that prevented even the operations commander from accessing complete information. He had two choices. He could continue to fly missions, document what he observed, and trust that someone in command knew what they were doing and had good reasons for the secrecy. Or he could start asking questions more directly and risk being removed from command and replaced with someone more willing to operate without context. He chose the first option, but with a modification. He would continue to document everything, but he would also start collecting evidence in a form that could survive classification. Physical records, personal logs, photographs when possible, anything that could later prove what had actually occurred at Route 66 airfield if official records were sealed or destroyed. On April 17th, Stark came to Blackwell's quarters after midnight and told him something that neither of them would include in any official report. Stark had been conducting routine maintenance on one of the F-86 Sabres, and he had discovered modifications to the aircraft's fuel system that he had not authorized and that did not appear in any maintenance documentation. The modifications allowed for extended range beyond standard combat configuration, which explained some of the fuel discrepancies Blackwell had been tracking. But more troubling was that the modifications appeared to have been installed before the aircraft arrived at Route 66, which meant they had been made by someone with access to Air Force supply chains and technical expertise but without going through standard maintenance protocols. Stark said he had found similar modifications on 2 other aircraft, and he suspected there were more he had not yet identified. He asked Blackwell what he should do. Blackwell told him to document the modifications in his personal maintenance logs but not to report them through official channels, and both men understood what that decision meant. The final confrontation with the unresolvable occurred on May 3rd, 1953, and it happened in a way that made clear documentation impossible. Blackwell was ordered to fly a mission that departed from every pattern Route 66 had established over the previous 3 months. Single aircraft, no wingman, night flight, which Route 66 had not conducted before. Specific coordinates that placed him within 10 miles of the Yalu River, closer than any previous mission had approached, and instructions to maintain radio silence except for emergency transmission. He pre-flighted the aircraft with Stark, who said nothing but whose expression communicated everything. The night was clear, moon 3/4 full, visibility good for night operations. Blackwell took off at 2200 hours and climbed to 25,000 feet, following the coordinates Chen had provided during a private briefing that afternoon. Chen had been more forthcoming than usual during that briefing, perhaps because he recognized that Blackwell deserved some degree of honesty before being sent on a mission this unusual. Chen said that intelligence indicated increased Soviet aircraft activity near the Yalu, that there was concern about a final offensive or provocation before armistice negotiations concluded, and that visual confirmation was required. Blackwell was selected because he had the experience and the judgment to observe without engaging, to gather intelligence without creating an incident that could derail peace talks. Blackwell flew northwest, following a route he had flown before, but never at night and never alone. The landscape below was invisible except where moonlight caught rivers or reservoir surfaces. He maintained altitude and heading, checking his instruments every 30 seconds, aware that any mechanical failure this far from base and this close to hostile territory would likely be unrecoverable. At the designated coordinates, he reduced speed and began a slow circular pattern, scanning visually and with radar for aircraft or ground activity. What he saw at 23:15 hours was something he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand and never succeeding. Multiple aircraft, he counted at least 7, flying in formation at approximately 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above his position. The radar signature indicated they were jets, high performance, but the formation pattern was wrong for combat operations. They were flying in a line, evenly spaced, at a speed that suggested neither combat maneuvering nor transit, just steady flight in a geometric pattern that looked more like a survey or mapping operation than military activity. He watched them for approximately 4 minutes, during which time they maintained their pattern without deviation, and then they altered course slightly and disappeared to the northwest toward Chinese airspace. Blackwell had violated radio silence protocol once in his career, and he violated it again that night. He transmitted a brief message to Route 66 describing what he had observed: 7 aircraft, jet signatures, unusual formation heading northwest, and requested instructions. The response came back within 60 seconds, which meant someone had been monitoring his frequency frequency and waiting for exactly this communication. Return to base. Maintain silence. Debrief on arrival. He landed at 0030 hours and went directly to the operations tent where Chen was waiting along with two other officers Blackwell had never seen before. They wore Air Force uniforms but no unit insignia, and they conducted the debriefing with a precision that made clear they had been preparing for exactly this scenario. They asked Blackwell to describe in detail what he had seen, what instruments had indicated, what he had transmitted, what response he had received. They recorded everything, thanked him for his service, and told him he was not to discuss the mission with anyone including other Route 66 personnel. Then they left, and Chen said quietly that Blackwell had done exactly what was needed and that the information would be handled appropriately. 3 days later, on May 6th, Blackwell received orders transferring him to a tactical air command position in Japan. Standard reassignment, routine rotation, no explanation required. Stark received orders the same day, reassignment to a training command position in California. Keller received orders for communications duty in the Philippines. Morrison and Hayes received orders for stateside assignments. Within 2 weeks, every officer who had been stationed at Route 66 Airfield during the March through May period was scattered to different assignments across the Pacific Theater and continental United States, separated from each other and from the airfield that officially had never existed in the form they remembered it. Before Blackwell left Route 66, he spent an afternoon walking the airfield perimeter, committing details to memory that he knew would not survive in official records. The fuel depot half buried in the hillside, the communications tent with equipment he still did not fully understand, the flight line where aircraft had been maintained to standards that exceeded combat requirements, and the aircraft themselves. 3 F-86 Sabres and 2 F-84 Thunderjets still parked on the hard stand, engines in what Stark had told him was operational standby status, meaning they could be started and flown with minimal preparation. Blackwell asked why the aircraft were being maintained in operational condition if the airfield was being decommissioned, and the ground crew sergeant told him the orders were to keep them ready until recovery operations were scheduled. Blackwell asked when recovery was scheduled, and the sergeant said he had not been given a date. Blackwell left Route 66 on May 21st, 1953, and those aircraft were still sitting on the hard stand, engines ready, waiting for crews that never arrived. He learned later, through inquiries that were never officially answered, that Route 66 Airfield was closed in early June, that some equipment was recovered and redistributed to other bases, but that some aircraft remained on site in status that official records described as operational pending recovery and never clarified further. The resolution that did not fully resolve came in pieces over decades. Blackwell returned to the United States in late 1953 and requested through official channels any documentation related to Route 66 airfield operations during his command period. The requests were denied on classification grounds. He requested his own flight logs from the February through May period, and he was provided with sanitized versions that showed standard combat air patrol missions with no reference to the coordinates he had actually flown or the observations he had actually made. He contacted other pilots who had served at Route 66, Hayes, Morrison, others whose names he had recorded, and discovered that their experiences matched his. They had flown missions from an airfield that was now being described as a temporary forward operating location for routine air superiority operations, nothing more. The intelligence gathering, the fuel discrepancies, the Soviet aircraft observations, the communications blackouts, none of it appeared in any accessible documentation. Blackwell continued to request information throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, and his requests were consistently denied or redirected to classification reviews that never concluded. He retired from the Air Force in 1968 with full honors and a service record that made no mention of Route 66 operations in any form that matched his memory of what had actually occurred. He kept his personal notebooks, his private logs, the photographs he had taken of the airfield before departing. He kept correspondence with other veterans who had been there and who were experiencing the same institutional erasure of their service, and he kept asking questions because the questions mattered more than whether answers were provided. In the 1980s, partial declassification of Korean War records began, and Blackwell was among the first to request specific files. Some records were released with heavy redaction, some were released in forms that contradicted his documented experience, flight logs that showed different coordinates than what he had recorded, fuel consumption records that showed standard usage rates without the discrepancies Stark had documented, communications logs that showed no blackouts or anomalies. It was as though someone had gone through official records and carefully removed any evidence that Route 66 had operated outside standard parameters, while leaving in place a cleaned version that supported the narrative of routine combat air operations. What Blackwell learned through these partial releases was enough to reconstruct some of the shape of what Route 66 had been doing, even if he never learned the full classified truth. Soviet aircraft activity near the Yalu River had been extensive in early 1953. American intelligence had been tracking it with increasing concern, and certain reconnaissance operations had been authorized to gather information that could not be obtained through standard channels without risking escalation that armistice negotiations could not survive. Route 66 had been one location, possibly not the only location, where those operations were conducted. The missions Blackwell had flown were real, the observations were real, but the documentation was classified at a level that prevented veterans from proving their service had occurred in the form they remembered. Blackwell died in 2003 at the age of 84, having never received complete access to Route 66 records. His family found among his possessions 17 notebooks documenting his service, along with letters from other veterans describing similar experiences at other locations during the Korean War, airfields that appeared in veterans' memories but not in official records, missions that consumed fuel and time but left no documentation, observations of Soviet aircraft that intelligence agencies acknowledged privately but never confirmed publicly. His daughter donated the notebooks to a military history archive where they sit today alongside other collections of veteran testimony that contradicts sanitized official histories. In 2015, a group of Korean War air combat veterans held a reunion specifically for personnel who had served at locations that were not adequately documented in official records. Route 66 was one of several airfields discussed. Men who had not seen each other in 60 years compared notes and discovered remarkable consistency in their memories. The fuel discrepancies, the communications anomalies, the classified briefings, the sudden reassignments, the institutional denial that followed. Some of these men had flight logs that matched Blackwell's personal documentation. Some had photographs of aircraft configurations that matched Stark's maintenance notes. Together, they built a collective archive of what Route 66 had been, even though official records still described it differently or not at all. Contemporary researchers examining Korean War air operations have identified Route 66 as one example of a larger pattern. Parallel operations conducted alongside official combat missions, operations designed to gather intelligence or conduct activities that could not be publicly acknowledged. Operations that were then either classified indefinitely or documented in ways that removed evidence of their actual character. The aircraft that were left on the hard stand at Route 66, engines ready, waiting for recovery that may or may not have occurred, those aircraft became symbols of something larger. They represented missions that happened but were not supposed to have happened. Service that was real but could not be officially confirmed. Sacrifice that occurred in the gap between what was documented and what was true. And the question that Blackwell spent 50 years asking never received a complete answer. What operations were actually conducted from Route 66 airfield in the final months of the Korean War? And why were those operations classified at a level that prevented the men who conducted them from ever receiving full acknowledgement of their service? This brings us back to where we started, to the gap between lived experience and official history, and to the particular isolation of knowing something happened while institutions refused to confirm it. The men who served at Route 66 carried that isolation for the rest of their lives. They flew missions that mattered, that gathered intelligence, that contributed to strategic decisions at levels they were never briefed on. They maintained aircraft and operated equipment and made decisions under pressure in service of operations that their own command structure would later describe differently or not at all. And when they asked for proof, for documentation, for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement that their memory was accurate, they were handed classification stamps and told that certain questions could not be answered. If you have experienced something similar, if you have known a truth that institutions refuse to document, if you have served in ways that were later erased or rewritten, if you carry memory that contradicts official history, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what you witnessed, what you know, what you were told could not be discussed. These stories matter. They fill in the gaps that official records leave empty. They preserve truth in the only way truth can be preserved, when institutions choose silence, through human testimony, through shared memory, through the collective archive of people who refuse to let their experience be erased. And if this story resonated with you, if it felt true in a way that matters, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this, more airfields, more operations, more veterans whose service exists in the space between what was documented and what was real. We are building an archive of those stories, one at a time, because someone needs to. Thank you for listening. And remember, just because something is not documented does not mean it did not happen. Sometimes the absence of documentation is the documentation.